Okay, final simple summary of the semester. I'm going to talk about the Civil War. Now, I talked about Lincoln, but this is more about the war itself and sort of how it unfolded, the twists, the turns, the general story of it. The Civil War was between two parts of the United States, the North and the South. As far as the United States government is concerned, there was no South. That was illegal. But as a practical matter, there were states in the southern part of the country, starting with South Carolina, that said, you know what, we're not part of the United States anymore. And starting in December of 1860, declared that they had left the Union. And the war essentially was a contest to decide whether the states could leave the Union and form their own country, or whether the Union was indivisible. And it was the position of the southern states that they had every right to leave the Union. And it was the position of the federal government in the North that they did not. And the war was to settle that issue. The fighting started when I want to say the South, that's not really accurate, when Southern forces, let's say that, fired on Fort Sumter, which was a federal fort held in a southern state. President Lincoln called up 75,000 initially volunteers, soldiers rather, to form the basis of an army to put down this rebellion. Eventually those numbers swelled, and this commenced a 4-year-long war in which 600,000 people were killed. All of them, except for a handful of foreigners who came looking for an adventure, were Americans. This was Americans versus Americans, brother, some cases literally brother versus brother. You had families in border states who were like, well, I'm going to go with the Union, or the other people, I'm going to go with the Confederacy, and they would literally end up sometimes fighting their family members. You had people from West Point who graduated from the military academy and considered themselves to be essentially brothers, who had fought under the American flag, and some of them said, nope, going with the Confederacy, and going to fight. Robert E. Lee is a good example, right? He had been in the United States Army for a long time, but he decided when Virginia, his home state, was going to leave the Union, even though he didn't agree with it, he stayed loyal, in his mind, to his home state over his nation. And that's why he was the main general for the South and not for the North. So if you look at a ledger and you sort of add up men and money and materials and people, just the populations in general, and the amount of food that people had, the amount of ammunition and railroads and all of the different things that would determine who could win a war in 1861, you would pick the North big time. They didn't have any real disadvantages compared to the South, except maybe for one. I would argue that the South had better generals. A lot of the South they had Lee, they had Stonewall Jackson, they had a lot of good generals. And so when the fighting began, you saw that one thing. And also, I wonder, at least initially, if the South was not a little bit better motivated, because from the Southerners' perspective, they thought they were fighting for their own freedom. Now, you can argue with that. I would argue with that. But that's what they thought, for sure. Whereas the North was fighting to, what? Preserve the Union, I guess, or they were fighting because they were called up and sent into battle by the president. I don't know how well they were initially as motivated as the South was. So in the early part of the war, the South was winning. The South won a lot of the early battles. The Union seemed to have really poorly led troops. The first name that I would mention to you was a man named George McClellan, who was a young general who fancied himself the next Napoleon, which is silly. He always found a way to not attack. He was always like, oh, you know, the Southerners, the rebels have more men than I do. And that wasn't true. I could spend 20 minutes talking about just McClellan, but to boil it down, he just didn't attack, even when he had more men. And so eventually Lincoln fired him and got somebody else in there and fired that person, kept cycling through generals because none of them were really any good. There was a guy named Ambrose Burnside. Now, do you know what sideburns are? You know, when you grow, right, sideburns? The name sideburns comes from Ambrose Burnside because he grew his hair in that way. That's where the name comes from. And that's about all he's good for as a general was, hey, that's the guy with sideburns, which should tell you not a very good general. So for 2 years, the South kept winning upset victories. And there was a danger. Now, first of all, why did the war begin? Let me back up. The South will tell you that it was about their freedom because they felt that once the United States had elected Abraham Lincoln as president, that they were going to be told to get rid of their slaves. And honestly, that wasn't true. I've already told you, Lincoln was like, if I want to preserve the Union, if we have to keep slavery to do that, then that's what we'll do. But that's what triggered the secession crisis that led to the war. Once the war began, they probably caused the thing that they were trying to prevent, because once the North went to war and shed the blood of its own young men, it probably was going to be the end of slavery. Anyway, in terms of the war, the turning point came in 1863 at a little village in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. They didn't plan to have a great battle there. It just sort of happened that way. The two armies happened to meet there. The Southern armies under General Lee had invaded north into Pennsylvania, and they were met at Gettysburg by the Union Army. There was a 3-day battle. I'm really cutting this super short. I could talk about Gettysburg for a week. In the end, the Union won that battle. And that was probably the best chance that the South had to win the war. If the South had won Gettysburg, now we don't know because that's science fiction, it's not what happened, they might have won the war. But they did not. And so from 1863 on, it was a long, slow kind of descent into defeat for the South. And they began to run out of people, and they began to run out of supplies, and the Union got stronger. The Union Army got stronger and stronger and stronger, and the Union Navy was running the blockades and choking off supplies, and it just became a slog. And so by the spring of 1865, it seemed fairly obvious that the South could not win the war, and they were fighting at this point just to kind of keep fighting, just out of honor. And so the top general, Lincoln finally got a good general, and his name was Ulysses S. Grant. He was fighting in the West, won a big battle at Vicksburg in Mississippi in 1863, and then was brought east by President Lincoln to run the whole war. And he understood how to win a war like that. You've got more people, you got more stuff, you got more everything, go at them and wear them down. And that's what Grant did. Anyway, by the spring of 1865, General Grant had begun to send messages to General Lee asking him, hey, I'm paraphrasing, I'm making it informal, but hey, do you want to sit down and talk about surrendering and ending this war? And in April of 1865, Lee and Grant met at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, and Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia, and this was essentially, not officially, but essentially the end of the Civil War. And the fighting gradually ended. The bells started ringing all over Washington in celebration, and Lincoln finally, on Good Friday in 1865, felt like a weight come off of him. He was like, he told his wife, I consider this the day that the war ended. And they got in their horse and buggy and went for a ride around Washington, just kind of peaceful, like they had felt as if they had crossed a barrier and the war was behind them. And Lincoln was talking about all the things that he wanted to do. He was talking about a day in which he was no longer president, several years away, and said, when I'm out of this office and when I'm done, I'd like to travel to the Holy Land. I'd like to see Israel. And so it was really like a great day for him that took a great load off his mind. Unfortunately, this does not have a happy ending, because that night he was scheduled to attend a performance at the theater. And this is something that he did during the war often. This was like his one sort of thing that he could do all during the war to just take a little bit of time away from the strain of the war and get a few hours of entertainment in. There was no movies then, right? There's no streaming, there's no this, there's no that. But he could go to the theater and enjoy that. And he frequently did go to the Grover Theater or to Ford's Theater, or different theaters around Washington. And he didn't really want to go that night. He was actually kind of tired. But he knew that people would be disappointed if he didn't go, because it was already in the newspapers that he was going to be there. And so he agreed to go, and he went downstairs at the appointed time. They had his carriage for him, along with his wife, along with Mrs. Lincoln. And there was an odd little thing where he got in to the carriage and turned to the man who was always there, who worked in the White House, who I guess he was a stableman. I forget who he was. It doesn't matter. But anyway, he always said to this person, good night, whenever they went off for the theater. And for some reason, this time, Lincoln said goodbye, not good night. And they traveled to the theater, and at about 10 o'clock that evening, he was shot in the back of the head by an assassin and was killed. And in a very real sense, he was almost the last casualty of the Civil War. He was killed by a Southern sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth, who thought Lincoln was a tyrant. He was seeking revenge for the defeat of the South in the war. So that's the Civil War, and of course Lincoln's assassination. Okay, write this up. Final simple summary, about a page. It needs to be in a Word document. I will take points off if you're just blasting this into the LMS. Write up a Word document with your name, date, etc. Write about a paragraph. Write about a page. Write about a page. You got plenty of details here. I told you, a nice long 12-minute and 55-second, too long of a video story. So anyway, that's simple summary for this week and for the semester. Good job, everyone. I hope you learned something in this class, and I hope you continue on in your studies to be a college student. Bye-bye.